Okay, so in my opinion, Blam is a near masterpiece level manga. So what happens if you take that author and have him write a space epic with giant mechs and monsters and slapstick comedy and a big old dose of harem? I think any sane person would say, please don't do that. And yet here we are. And being right up front about all this, I'm definitely not the target demographic for at least half of this. Like, harems? Definitely not. Not even slightly interested. Slapstick comedy? For the most part, no thank you. But I can get down with some giant mech battles. I'll read that. And I was definitely ready to get some more Nihei in my life. After Blam, I was just about ready to just start injecting that shit into my veins. And not to draw the tension out here, I was very pleasantly surprised with the way this mix actually went down and the way it turned out. So let's get into it. It starts off with Nagate all by himself after his grandfather dies. And within like 10 pages, he has stumbled onto the rest of mankind, met several of the main characters, and the physical comedy is in full force because he has been beat up by Kunato, and he has stumbled into the female's locker room. It's just not wasting any time getting going here. And to be honest, it was very jarring for someone who came directly from reading Blam into this, because even though the artwork is very much Nihei, and everything about it just screams Nihei, the tone of the manga itself is extremely different. Like, not even close to being the same thing. And to be honest, I wasn't super crazy about it either. Like I said up top, I'm really not a fan of harems. I'm not a huge fan of the silly slapsticky comedy, and it just wasn't Blam. And I was just like, I'm not sure about this. And then very quickly, we get into a space battle with the Ghana. And the art in that is, well, let's just say that there are some panels in here that are drawn in a way that would probably make H.R. Giger proud. Like things going in places and spaces, and I don't even know how much of it I could put on YouTube, to be honest. Anyway, right off the bat, we get a lot of character work and a real strong focus on it. We quickly meet Hoshijiro and Izana, and we get some just real stereotypical character scenes that you would see in just about any other thing like this. And it's like, oh, a day in the life doing this, or a day at the beach with Izana, and oh no, I got Izana's crotch in my face. Just real typical stuff. And let's talk about Izana here for a quick second, because this manga was written in 2009, and her character feels way ahead of its time for 2009. In this, we exist in a world where all of humanity is basically genetically engineered at this point in time, and some of them have been genetically engineered to be truly genderless. Until a point in their life at which they choose their gender or just kind of transition into what their gender will eventually be. And it's completely fascinating, and it creates some genuine gender struggles. Like, she's essentially treated like she's a boy by most of the characters in the book, but she feels like she's a female. And all this for right now is just to say that there's such a heavy emphasis on character work. I'll circle back to Izana here a little bit later and talk about her a little bit more. I'm just saying, for 2009, this felt ahead of its time. But anyway, back to those stereotypical scenes that we're getting, and all of this character work that we're really building. Even though this is ultimately going to be a harem, it is really made obvious from the get-go that our main love interest is going to be between Nagate and Hoshijiro. Like, everybody's vying for Nagate's attention, but his attention's always on her. They get stuck in a pod under the water together. She ends up floating away in space, and he goes to save her. Then they get stuck in a mech together. Like, it's really front and center that nobody else is even really an option for a love interest for Nagate other than Hoshijiro. Which is why, when about 2/3 of the way through the first book, she dies, I was like, wait, what? Wait, what just happened? Like, I was literally like, wow. I was shocked, to say the least. And then by the end of the first book, she like returns as this grown clone that is the main like antagonist of the story, the Crimson Hawk Moth. And then there's another version of the grown Gona thingy that they capture and keep in a containment tank on the ship. And then he goes and visits this weird Hoshijiro Gona growth thing. So maybe this isn't going to be your typical mecha harem. Nihei's on the loose. But seriously, this really just feels different when you read it. And Nihei will eventually introduce some really gruesome aspects to the art and the manga in general. And some real elements of body horror. It's going to introduce the scientist named Ochiai. He will eventually take over Kunato with this like weird parasite thing. There are going to be some creatures that very much so resemble some things that we've seen in Blam. This in general, as it goes on, is going to lean very heavily into the gruesome and the grotesque. And the scenes that lean into the gruesome and the grotesque are also the scenes that really lean into the erotic. So if that's the kind of thing you're into, Nihei's got your back. For some reason, as I describe that, it doesn't sound like a pleasant thing at all. And maybe there's just something wrong with me in particular, but I like the art. Also, real quick, if you have any problems with like trypophobia, this might be triggering for you in certain panels of it. Just saying. And we haven't even talked about the action yet. Wow. I mean, fucking wow. The action in this is great. And I don't know if I'm just getting used to reading Nihei more or if Nihei's getting better at drawing action. This was so much easier for me to track and follow exactly what was happening from panel to panel and page to page than Blam was. And I don't know if it's because I feel like it's because he's drawn this better, or at least the action flows better, so I can just kind of go from like page to page to page and I just really flow through the action. Whereas Blam was like, what the just happened? I'm so lost. And this I was nowhere near as lost. I feel like he drew this differently, but I could just be better at reading his style after all of the volumes that I've been through. Not that that's that many, I don't. Anyway, either way, it feels big. It feels epic, and you feel the stakes as you're reading it. It really starts to weigh on you as the volumes go on, that the fate of all humankind really is hanging in the balance here. And towards the end, there are going to be some battles, some big epic battles that go on for what feels like forever. I mean, just chapters, and it is awesome. And while all this is happening, we never at any point lose that light-hearted feeling that he has that flows through the whole manga, and we never lose the comedy. And the character work always is front and center of the entire thing. He even keeps up the harem act as it goes on, and I didn't hate it. Constantly introducing new girls to be infatuated with Nagate, and you end up falling in love with pretty much every single character that's introduced. It even makes the Gona clone of Hoshijiro end up being a sympathetic character, that to the point where it is taken and used as an experiment to create some weapon. You feel bad for the Gona. And that weapon that it creates ultimately is Tsumugi. And then Tsumugi is like a mix of Gona and an organic mech, kind of, and Hoshijiro's consciousness might be in there somewhere, and it lives in this organic mech body, but it's also kind of like a weird room full of organs sometimes, but it communicates through a tentacle that looks kind of like a penis. It's weird. And I did not trust this thing at first. Like, I legitimately, it was a little creepy. And I really didn't know how to feel about it in general. And I just didn't trust it eavesdropping and poking up and around and sneaking around and slithering in places it shouldn't be slithering. And then it wants to try and be your friend and stuff. I'm a little off-put by tentacle monsters trying to be my friend. That's all I'm saying. And this just brings me back to the character work. These characters will just grow on you as they grow on each other, and the subtle nuance that's involved with nailing some of them. Like Izana, for example. Let's go ahead and come back to her for a second. Like I said before, she is a genderless person. She also is in love with Nagate, just like everybody else. And she's also probably the closest person to him in the entire story, especially since Hoshijiro basically died, and Izana is kind of like the one true through-line friend that he has, ultimately becoming kind of the best friend he has in the entire thing. She ultimately will become full female in response to her feelings for him, or she chooses to because of her feelings for him, however that works. And ultimately, in the end, they don't end up together. And to be fair, they never really were meant to be. Even in the first volume, you can tell that it's just not really meant to be. He loves Izana as a friend, and Izana loves him as maybe something that's more than that, and it just ultimately never pans out, and it's really kind of sad. And ultimately you feel really bad for Izana because she really did love him, and she changed basically her whole being for him, and it doesn't work out. And it's sad, but it's also just so real, because that's kind of how life is. Things that you want don't always work out, don't always pan out in the way that you want them to. And ultimately, at the end of the day, in the end of the story, they don't end up together. But the friendship that they build and develop throughout the story and throughout the struggles that they have in the story, their friendship will ultimately stand the test of time. And they will end the story as the best of friends that they were always throughout the story. It's just such a wonderful through line. I loved it so much just because of the nuance that their particular relationship carried. And as sad as some of the aspects of their relationship were, it was also the most heartfelt and uplifting at the same time. Such good writing. And all of this stuff just kind of happens. None of it's really front and center. It's really just developing in the background as you go through the story. And absolutely anything that in today's world would be viewed as maybe gender politics never feels like it's up in front and center of the story, never feels like it's preachy or trying to be progressive in any way, shape, or form. It just feels natural and organic and a part of the people and a part of the characters that you're following in the story. It really just feels like really real people stuck in really extraordinary situations, forming real bonds throughout. And in the end, those real bonds will become real love and real relationships. And at the end of the day, I really feel like this is the kind of forward-thinking storytelling that the writers of 2023 can only dream of. And this was 2009. And it all works because the story and the stakes and the tension are really what's at the forefront of the story. The action, the suspense, the build-up, the end of all existence stakes that keep you glued to the edge of your seat the entire time. And by the end of the manga, those stakes have gotten so big that you have absolutely no idea how they'll ever get out of this. Like, how are they going to win? I don't know. Don't ask me. I mean, I do know because I read the story, but I bet that's the feeling that you get. It's just awe-inspiring. And like, for example, how big the action gets and the character work that I keep coming back to. Like, for example, when Kunato comes back in the end and gets to pilot the Tsugumori. Now, you don't like Kanato. You've never liked Kanato. Kanato's pretty much been a garbage character from the beginning. Garbage as in the character that you really disliked throughout. I mean, you didn't like him when he was Kunato at the beginning because he was like a spoiled brat and he was kind of an asshole. But he was also kind of like the best of the best, and he was trained to be the best, and he was trained to inherit the Sugimori in the first place. Then Nagate comes around and he's better, and he gets to take it instead, and he turns into this real hateful, spoiled brat, and you're like, Kanato's a dick. Then he becomes this like Ochi parasite puppet, and you don't like him because he's this puppet of Ochi controlled by a little worm. So no version of Kanata has ever been a sympathetic character in any way, shape, or form. So for when he comes back in the end and he gets his mind back and it's life or death stakes and he has to take half the fleet and do half the battle and he gets the Sugimori for the first time pretty much ever, the thing that he felt he was born to pilot, and it's given to him and he has to save half of all humanity. He gets tasked with half of the final battle. You're like, oh, I love Kanata. And you're like, wait a second, how did this happen? I've never liked Kanata at any point. But here I am like, this is the greatest thing ever because it's so well built. It's so well developed. I was so invested by the end. I was so into the stakes. I was so into the story. I was so into the world. I was so into the people and the characters that I was literally like on that screaming for Kanata. The worst of the worst, but he got this redemption arc, and you ended up disliking him so much throughout the thing, you forgot that he was actually the best of the best before Nagate got there. He was also a spoiled brat and a baby, but still. So yeah, it just it pays itself off so well. Everything is so good. I couldn't say enough. And then of course in the end they win. Everything comes out happy story, you know. They end up settling on a planet. All of humankind settles on this planet. And after, I don't know, 10 years or so, they decide to split humanity in half. Half of humanity decides to stay on this planet, and the other half of humanity will get back on the Sidonia, relaunch the Sidonia, and continue its original mission. This in turn will cause our beloved cast to split, and you might be surprised, I know I was, at which ones ultimately choose to stay and which ones choose to go back out into space and basically continue on. And now you're sad because they all just broke up and you don't know, those two should have, but they were so close. Why are they gonna separate? Now they'll never see each other again. I'm sad. And it was just amazing. I loved it. I loved everything about it. Now I kind of have to go out and get a possums, don't I? Because wow, was this good. And I made it this far without properly gushing about just how amazing the art of Tsutomu Nihei really is. He's just phenomenal. And if if you really wanted to ask me between this and Blam, I'm gonna go Blam. I think it's the better of the two. I think it was more personally catered to my tastes and interests than this one was. But if you would have told me the interworkings of this and said, this is what Nihei's next project is going to be, or I don't know if it was his next, but the next thing you're going to read from him, I would have been like, nah, it doesn't sound like that's going to work. I would have been wrong. I was wrong. It did work. It was great. I'm going to give this an absolute 9. I suggest anyone who hasn't read this, read it. I really kind of hope you didn't watch this video if you hadn't read it, because I tried not to spoil too much, but I had to talk about some things, and I really just had to gush about this for a little while. I loved it. 9. As always, everybody, the link for my Patreon is in the description below. The link for my Discord's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.